Hi ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Science Explorations 9, and this video is going to talk about terrestrial ecosystems, and so we're going to do a little bit of a who's who in terrestrial ecosystems near you, because before we can start to talk about energy flow and food webs in terrestrial ecosystems, we kind of have to know what they are and who lives in them. So, what is a terrestrial ecosystem? And you can see here, a terrestrial ecosystem is anything considered to be a land-based ecosystem. And on the surface, that seems really easy and a very straightforward definition. However, what happens when for 6 months of the year, the land is flooded with water, and for the next 6 months of the year, the land is dry? So is it a terrestrial-based ecosystem, or is it an aquatic ecosystem? And so these are some of the questions that you're going to have to ask. Anyways, let's take a look at the variety of different terrestrial ecosystems that exist in Earth's biosphere. Some of these will be very familiar to you in Southern Ontario, and some of them will not be. The first one, forests. These can either be rainforests or tropical forests or boreal forests or temperate forests, deciduous forests, conifer forests. There's a number of different kinds of forests that biologists and ecologists like to group forests into. You know what forests are. They're an ecosystem dominated by trees. Deserts. These are ecosystems dominated by a very low amount of precipitation. Interestingly, the Antarctica is considered to be a desert, even though there are 3 kilometers of snow and ice over top of the land. There's very little snow, and it is considered to be a desert. The tundra, this is any area near the poles that has permafrost in the ground and usually very short stunted trees. Taiga is marshy, swampy, bog-like areas that you find in northern Canada, just south of the tundra. And then we move to grasslands, and grasslands, we do have some prairies in southern Ontario. If you go near the shores of Lake Huron, you'll actually find some natural prairie ecosystems. But if you think about Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, those are dominated by a lot of grasslands. So let's talk about who's living in these terrestrial ecosystems. Well, you can see that we can talk about mosses, and we can talk about ferns. And interestingly, these are two very important early evolved plants who make up producers. But interestingly, very few organisms actually eat these two. One of the ways they survive is just to be kind of disgusting to eat. And so oddly, almost nothing eats moss, and very few things eat ferns. So while they do capture sunlight and turn it into food, sugars, and they do bring carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and make it into material for the ecosystem, not a lot of stuff directly eats mosses and ferns until you get to decomposers. Then we have our plants, herbaceous plants and grasses. These make up the vast majority of what is eaten in a terrestrial ecosystem. There are also shrubs. These are shorter plants that have stems that are made of wood, and trees. These are, as you can see in the picture below, what people think of when they think of forests. So these are the main producers in our terrestrial ecosystems. I've included here another term, lichen. If you look at this tree right here, you can see it has some gray stuff growing up the side of it. Lichen is an amazing organism. It's a relationship between a fungus and algae, and the algae actually grows within the fungus, and the algae makes food for the fungus in the form of sugars, and the fungus holds onto water so that the algae can grow. So that's called a symbiotic relationship, and we'll get into some relationships in another video. But this can also be considered a producer within a terrestrial ecosystem. Once we go through that, we've got many of the same larger organisms that you would see in an aquatic ecosystem living in a terrestrial ecosystem. Insects, by far the most common, beetles, and lots of other insects that live within wood and in the soil of a terrestrial ecosystem. And of course, we've got birds. And birds are eating a lot of the insects that are in the terrestrial ecosystem. Amphibians, lots of newts and salamanders, toads, and some frogs. There's also mollusks. So when you think about snails and slugs in your garden, those are mollusks that live in terrestrial ecosystems. Snakes and turtles make up the reptiles that live in a terrestrial ecosystem, but there's also lots of other arthropods that live there as well. So instead of just insects, which are an arthropod, there are also millipedes and centipedes, and lots of other creepy crawly critters that we call arthropods for jointed feet. Okay, so that's why we call them arthropods. And finally, what everybody always thinks about most easily, mammals. So we have mice, and we have raccoons, and porcupines, and squirrels. And if you're in another terrestrial ecosystem in another continent, you might have elephants, and giraffes, and rhinoceros, and antelope. And what you should be able to do is come up with probably a dozen mammals for a North American terrestrial ecosystem. So if you can think about coyotes and wolves and bears, squirrels, deer, moose, beavers, muskrat, all kinds of different mammals that would live in a terrestrial ecosystem, that would be great. And ideally what you would do right now is you would put together a food web of all the critters that we have just talked about and make sure that you can show the flow of energy from the producers to the consumers up through the trophic levels. So finally, how do we get to how humans mess up an aquatic ecosystem? So there's a couple of different ways that we do this. One of the most key is habitat destruction. Humans like to go through and cut down trees. And if you cut down trees in a terrestrial ecosystem, you expose the soil to erosion, which ends up completely wiping out any of the aquatic ecosystem that was there. Related to that, as I said, cutting down trees or overexploitation will change the ecosystem. But there's also sorts of different ways of doing it. Peat bogs in Europe have been destroyed, and their ecosystems have been destroyed, which can in some ways be considered terrestrial. When they've dried out, because the dried out peat is mined and used as a garden supplement in North America, and so we overexploit those kind of situations. As we mentioned in the aquatic ecosystem video, climate change is a huge issue. As you change the climate in an area, you change the kinds of species of trees and plants that can exist there, and you can certainly change the ecosystem. Invasive species are becoming a huge problem. In fact, gardeners who plant trees from other areas actually are changing the ecosystems around their areas. So for example, the Norway maple, which you may have growing in front of your school or in front of your home, is actually an invasive species and should probably not be planted in a forest like this. Waste dumping, any place that you throw litter, is unsightly in an ecosystem, but maybe not quite as harmful as you might think. However, if you are a mining company and you decide to dump your toxic mining tailings in a terrestrial ecosystem, you can really damage the soil. And so when we're talking about waste dumping, we're talking about large amounts of dumping, whether it's municipalities dumping their landfill in a terrestrial ecosystem or industry dumping. Could be anything from mine tailings to mining waste to maybe nuclear waste even can cause huge problems in terrestrial ecosystems. Finally, acid rain. As we talked about with aquatic ecosystems, what acid rain does is it rains down on the soil, and the acids help dissolve different minerals out of the soil, such as aluminum. And when you have aluminum that's mobile in the soil, it can be taken up by the trees, and this in turn poisons trees. So acid rain is another way that we have impacted terrestrial ecosystems. And so that concludes our video on terrestrial ecosystems, who's who in a terrestrial ecosystem near you, and how humans can impact terrestrial ecosystems.